The Travel Transformation Podcast is proud to be partnered with Give the Goodness Global, an amazing global outreach project helping families in need all over Southeast Asia and beyond. Please check them out at Instagram.com/Give the Goodness Global today. And now on to the podcast episode.
Welcome to the Travel Transformation Podcast, where we talk all things travel and all things transformation, exploring the life-changing potential of solo travel, intentional travel, and location-independent working. Whether you're an aspiring digital nomad or simply wish to boost your confidence through epic travel experiences, I'm here to motivate and inspire you to go after all your wildest dreams. I'm Jessica Grace Coleman, author, certified travel coach, founder of the Travel Transformation Company, and your host for the Travel Transformation Podcast. Travel changed my life. Now let's change yours. You ready? Let's go.
Hello and welcome to the Travel Transformation Podcast. I'm your host, Jess, and this episode is going to be a little bit different and a little bit spooky. So perhaps I should have done this at Halloween, but never mind. So I was in a beta program for a sponsored travel course last year, run by Marie Hernandez, who I interviewed last year as well. And one of the things she mentioned, we were talking about sponsored travel and where we want to go and how it doesn't have to be all these exotic places, it can be local. Obviously, not everyone is from your hometown, so not everyone thinks of your hometown as maybe you think it's a bit boring, maybe you're just used to it, you've been there your whole life, perhaps, and it doesn't seem like a travel destination to you. And she was like, you can do sponsored travel experiences in your local area because other people who are not from your local area might be interested. And it kind of stuck with me and I was like, that's true. There is actually a lot of history in my hometown, which is Stafford in the Midlands in Staffordshire in England. And perhaps other people would be interested in it. And then it got me thinking about this venture I attempted to do many, many moons ago. I was really into historical walking tours and ghost tours of places. Like I love going to somewhere like Stafford-upon-Avon and doing a walking tour around there, hearing all the history, all the ghosty, spooky things. And I'd been reading several books and I knew of several things about my local area. And I was like, maybe I could do a walking tour. And I did actually write an entire script for it. Me and my friend Ruth, we even interviewed people who could take the tour itself because I was not confident enough to do it myself. And we even did a trial run around Stafford. It didn't go totally great, which is why it never went anywhere. But I've always kept the script and I always thought it's a bit of a shame that it's gone to waste because I put a lot of effort into it, a lot of time, a lot of research, and trying to make it into this entertaining look at the darker side of Stafford, my hometown. So I thought, why not put it on this travel podcast? Because I'm not traveling to get there, but other people may well be traveling in the area. I know a lot of people, specifically in the States and things like that, who love hearing about history of the UK and all that kind of stuff. So I thought maybe someone would be interested. And even if you are from Stafford or live here, you might not know some of this stuff. So it might end up being a two-part of this episode because I've looked at the script and it is long. So I'm just basically going to read it off, try and make it interesting as if I'm a tour guide taking you around Stafford. And I think there are some sort of notes about where you will be. So I'm going to read those out as well. So if you are in Stafford, you can actually take the tour yourself. You could listen to this podcast and walk around, which I think is kind of cool. So the idea was, it was called the Darker Times Tours. I had a whole thing, Darker Times publication, Darker Times anthologies. I had a Darker Times writing competition. So it was this whole thing. And this is the introduction. And we were going to meet outside the Shire Hall, near the steps and the benches. And the Shire Hall is this beautiful building right in the middle of Stafford in the town centre in the market square. So here we go. And maybe pretend it's Halloween while you're listening to this. Okay. Welcome to the Darker Times of Stafford tour. Tonight you'll learn about grisly crimes, infamous executions, paranormal phenomena and superstitious relics. And hear how murderers, ghosts and witches have made Stafford their home. For the truth is, lurking beneath the modern facade of most English towns and villages, there is a dark and sinister past waiting to be unearthed, and Stafford is no exception. We'll get to the ghosts and the witches later. But first, I'd like to tell you about another group of people who have honoured, or perhaps dishonoured, the area with their presence. These people can immortalise towns, they can taint a place's reputation, and they can haunt an area better than any ghost ever could. So, what is the name of this terrifying group of people? Writers. You see, we have a bit of a claim to fame here in Stafford's town centre. In 1852, the author Charles Dickens stayed the night in the Swan Hotel after going on a tour of the Spode Copeland factory in Stoke-on-Trent. He enjoyed his factory tour so much that he constantly wrote about the area in his magazine Household Words under the title of A Plated Article. Now, you'd probably think this would be a good thing, wouldn't you? Good for the area, good for tourism, good for putting the perhaps previously overlooked town on the map, right? Wrong. Unfortunately, Dickens wasn't exactly taken with our little town. In fact, in only the second sentence of the article, he describes Stafford as being as dull and dead a town as anyone could desire not to see. Not a great start, and believe me, it only got worse. The Swan, one of the main hotels in the town centre, which is still there, didn't exactly get off lightly either. Dickens refers to the hotel as being extinct, and constantly calls it the Dodo in the dull High Street. When Dickens visited, there was a watchmaker's shop opposite the Swan, or the Dodo, if you will. He expressed that the clocks and watches must be stopped, I am sure, for they could never have the courage to go, with the town in general and the Dodo in particular looking at them. Oof! He goes on to describe the water wheel at the mill as going heavily round and round like the monotonous days and nights in this forgotten place. The wheel from the mill can still be seen outside the gates to Victoria Park. He even goes so far as to say there is small discernible difference between being buried alive in the town and buried dead in the town tombs. Not the kind of publicity you want, really. We'll hear more of Dickens' enthusiastic descriptions later, but for now, let's start this tour of murder, spirits, and superstition. We'll be hearing plenty of the dead, but at the risk of disrespecting old Charles, you can believe me when I say that Stafford is anything but dull. So we then move to the middle of the square, the market square facing the Shire Hall. Stafford was originally a walled town, its area being only slightly bigger than the main shopping region you can see today. Hardly any of the original walls or gates can be seen now, but as you'll notice from walking around, its street names still reflect its medieval design. North Walls, South Walls, Greengate Street, Eastgate Street, Foregate Street and Jailgate Street. By the 1920s, the town's wall was still quite intact, but it was put to a different use than its original purpose. The land immediately behind the wall was called Thieves' Ditch, and it had become a useful place to dump the rubbish of Stafford, a bit like sweeping the dirt under the rug. If it was out of sight, it was out of mind. You can still see part of the original wall next to the roundabout near Asda, although it has been moved from its ancient site. Going back to the mid-19th century, and around the time Mr. Dickens was tearing into the town in his article, it is clear that it wasn't a very desirable place to live for anyone. During the 1830s, drainage was pretty much non-existent, and general rubbish was thrown in front of the houses where it was left to putrefy. Nice. The water supply came from wells where most of the water was contaminated by the many cesspits that would leak into the soil. Fevers were common, and general health was badly affected by the dirtiness of the area. A visiting judge is said to have described Stafford as being the most stinking town I was ever in my life. I think we're beginning to see why Charles was less than enchanted with the place. But at least he tried to say how much he hated it in a more poetic way. The town centre was often used for cattle fairs, the larger beasts often being a source of terror and alarm to the young ladies of Stafford. But a couple of centuries ago, the market square wasn't just used for trading animals. Incredibly, it was also a place where you could trade your wife. Now, there are many recorded instances of wife selling in the county, with marketplaces such as this playing host to auctions of the human variety. These known trades lasted into the 19th century, and there are even records of them occurring at later dates. The unbelievable procedure for selling one's wife, if you'd had enough of her, was to tie a halter around her neck as if she were any cow or horse you wanted to sell and lead her down to the local market. I'm hoping this isn't true. I did this research a long time ago. But the indignity didn't stop there. The husband bought a ticket to get her through the toll and then proceeded to lead her around the market several times before starting the auction. Back in those days, people believed that if they followed the same rules they abided when selling livestock, the sale would be legal. It wasn't quite as bad as it sounds. Okay. In all recorded instances of wife selling, it had already been arranged with another man previously, usually someone who had been carrying on with the wife anyway, or at least wanted to, and the price was settled before the theatrics of the sale were carried out. When purchased, the husband would hand over the toll ticket to the new owner of the wife, who would pay the agreed amount, and then all three would retire to a local inn where the sale was sealed with a hearty drink. Okay, I don't like the idea of them being led around like cattle, but at least they all went and had a tipple afterwards. A Wolverhampton newspaper in 1832 told of a disgraceful scene that took place right here in Stafford Market. A Rodney Hall of Dunstan Heath near Penkridge led his wife into the town centre as has been described and sold her to a man known as Barlow for 18 pence and a quart of ale. The custom became less common after the Matrimonial Causes Act in 1857, which made the procedure of divorce shorter and less expensive, meaning there was less need to sell your wife to the neighbours to get rid of her. It is hardly worth noting that, of course, wives weren't allowed to get rid of their husbands in the same way. So why were so many Stafford men willing to part with their wives for a fee and some alcohol? A local rhyme from around that time may tell us why, and here you must remember that the word queen, spelled Quean, doesn't have quite the same meaning as it does today. The rhyme goes, Nottingham full of hogs, Derbyshire full of dogs, Leicestershire full of beans, Staffordshire full of queens. And queen, I regret to inform you, meant disreputable at best and prostitute at worst. So maybe that's why wives were being sold left, right and centre in this county. Before we leave the market square, let me draw your attention to the Shire Hall. This was completed in 1798 and was home to the criminal courts or county assizes until 1991. Many terrible trials took place here, including that of the murder of Christina Collins in Ridgely in 1839. More will be heard of her horrific ending when we visit the place of the executions shortly. Not surprisingly, the old building apparently has a resident ghost. He is said to walk through the Shire Hall gallery and the library. Not much is known of this spectre, whether he was tried in the criminal courts for ghastly murder or if he's just partial to a bit of reading. All we know is that he is called Claude, and he still wanders through the entire building to this day. Now we're heading to the Gatehouse Theatre. Theatres always seem to have some kind of ghostly presence, and with the original building dating back to 1877, it's not surprising that the Gatehouse makes this claim as well. Originally home to the Borough Council, the Borough Hall was reopened as the Gatehouse in 1982, and ever since there have been tales of shadowy figures and unexplained images haunting the old building. There have been reports of a lady seen on the main stairs, unsettling the cleaner staff so much that many prefer not to work alone, especially after dark. It is said that the lady wears beautiful clothes and is referred to as either the posh lady or the more usual name for female spirits, the grey lady. The fragrance of lavender seems to follow her wherever she goes, and many strange banging noises have been heard when no one is around to be making them. Now, I told you of Stafford's impressive, if slightly embarrassing, famous connection with Charles Dickens, but we do have a more recent claim to fame of the more haunted variety. In 2006, Derek Acora and his team came to Stafford for an episode of their Ghost Towns TV series. The Ghost Towns truck parked up in the town centre and hundreds of residents came out to share their ghostly experiences of the county town. The Gatehouse Theatre was one of the places that Derek decided to investigate, and he was taken around the building after dark by the staff members at the time. Some of the staff admitted that they didn't like going in certain areas of the theatre when they were on their own, or if they were locking up and had to turn the lights off. A customer who was also a psychic once told them that she could sense company on the grand staircase. The woman she saw was apparently wearing black from head to toe, but she couldn't be seen clearly due to a cloud that accompanied her wherever she went. That must be incredibly frustrating. The cloud, following you around. Derek Acora felt that the spirit, called Victoria, was grounded in the theatre, having not yet found her way to the other side. He sensed that she had lost her life when she was in her late 20s and that she had a high fever which caused her to lose her balance and fall over the stairs. During a rescue of the spirit, a member of staff was overcome with pins and needles and said she could sense her in a corner of the room. Derek thought that the lady spirit might have been an orator or someone who was good at public speaking, and this was seconded by Stafford historian Jeff Elkin, who explained that suffragette speakers used to come to the building, as well as women who wanted to hear the latest novels being read to them. It sounds to me that the woman was a bit of a bookworm, and I'd like to think that her and Claude from the library meet up every now and then. So then we head to the roundabout island near the prison. So in a few minutes we'll be continuing on to Stafford Prison, but before we get there I'm going to tell you a little bit about the horrific events that used to take place there. The jail had its 15 minutes of fame in 1907 when it could be found on the front of postcards promoting Stafford. Now, this isn't as odd as it first sounds, considering that the early 20th century trend was for producing postcards with pictures of murders, car crashes, and lightning strikes plastered over them. That's right. The nearby village of Great Haywood released a postcard in 1905 commemorating a terrible motor accident in which 2 women died, and a souvenir postcard from Hensford in 1919 showed the face of the murdered Elizabeth Gaskin and the locations associated with her death at the hands of her estranged husband. This murder was particularly gruesome as her husband had hacked her head off, admitting to the police that she is in pieces. Just the thing you want your town to be remembered for. And just the thing you want to get on a postcard in the post. Very strange. The jail as we see it today was built in 1793 when public executions were carried out on a scaffold which was raised on top of the building. In 1817, hangings were moved to the front of the gatehouse and, just like the macabre postcards, public executions brought in the tourists. A lot of them. Crowds of 10,000 for a single hanging were not unheard of, and it wasn't just murderers who found themselves swinging at the end of a rope in front of an audience. I feel like I should have put a trigger warning at the start of this episode to say that it's got some gross stuff in here. People could also be put to death for burglary, sheep stealing, and forgery. Executions were often seen as entertainment, a day out for the locals and perhaps a mini break for visitors from much further away. People would make it a day to remember with much drinking and merrymaking. And it is said that the local ladies of the night, or queens, as we already know Staffordshire was known for, did particularly well out of the frenzied masses that attended the hangings. Oof. Ironically, local pickpockets also came out in force, taking full advantage of the crowds which the executions generated, even though theft was itself a hanging offence. Now I will tell you the tale of George Smith, the Rowley hangman, a Staffordshire man who was born in 1805 near Rowley village. He was a heavy drinker and a regular at the local courts and was used to spending time in prison due to charges of poaching, petty larceny, and failing to support his family. His real story starts in 1840. The murder of 37-year-old Christina Collins, whose body was found floating in the canal in Brindley Bank near Rugeley, had captured the imagination of the locals, who turned out in force in 1840 to see the public executions of her convicted killers, James Owen and George Thomas. Owen and Thomas were supposed to be accompanying Christina to London to meet her husband, but instead they took advantage of having a lone woman on their canal boat, drunkenly threatening her and eventually killing her. The trial had been carried out at the Stafford Assizes, and 2 of the 3 men involved found guilty and sentenced to death. There was only one problem with the execution. The hangman, William Calcraft, was without his assistant, Tom Cheshire, who was so hungover after a night of heavy drinking at the Shoulder of Mutton pub that he never turned up to the jail. Calcraft asked the prison governor for help, and George Smith was the only volunteer. The 2 Collins murderers were hanged with George's assistance, and his new career had begun. George Smith's role as assistant was often a gorier job than that of the actual hangman. As Calcraft only ever gave what is called a short drop, the assistant would be required to swing on the legs of the condemned man after he had dropped in order to speed up what would otherwise be an excruciatingly slow death. Ooh, think of that next time you think your job's not great. Incidentally, if anyone here is an Inspector Morse fan, Colin Dexter based his 8th Morse novel, The Wench is Dead, on the Christina Collins murder, after spending many hours researching the crime in Stafford's William Salt Library. Another one of Staffordshire's claims to fame, and yet again it is one based on murder and death, but it doesn't even come close to the next of our gruesome claims to fame. If you'd like to follow me to the prison, I will tell you the story of the most notorious man to ever be hanged outside Stafford Jail, the infamous Prince of Poisoners, Dr. William Palmer. So then we walked to the prison, stopping in County Road opposite the main prison doors. William Palmer was born and raised in Rugeley, a small town approximately a 10-mile drive from here. He married Annie Palmer in Abbots Bromley and had a son, Willie. He was a doctor and racehorse owner, had many friends, and was well known for caring about his mother. Quite a normal man by the sounds of it. But his short life, he was only 31 when he died, was punctuated with strange and suspicious incidents. You see, people had a terrible habit of dying when they were around him. It all started with a man called Abley, who died after drinking rather a lot of brandy on a dare. But guess who dared him, and guess who handed him the drinks? That's right, it was Mr. Palmer. Many other people died soon after an encounter with Palmer, but the darkest thing about the whole affair is that many were members of his own family. All of the children his wife gave birth to after Willie died in infancy, and some people said he used to put poison on his fingers to feed the babies as he couldn't afford any more children. It is thought that Palmer also poisoned his mother-in-law, Mrs. Thornton, in an attempt to inherit her properties. I'll leave the mother-in-law jokes out of this, but by all accounts, Mrs. Thornton was a truly awful woman, having driven her partner, Colonel Brooks, to suicide and then deciding to live on a diet solely made up out of gin and more gin. She became ill and moved in with the Palmers, where she lasted less than 2 weeks. Now, so far, the adults I've mentioned both had horrific deaths, but there was alcohol and lots of it involved in both, so you can start to see how Palmer got away with his poisoning, if that is indeed what he did, for so long. In his book on Palmer, Robert Graves describes Stafford like so. The town contains no less than 13,000 inhabitants, of whom at least 3,000 are usually sober, reckoning children among that number. It is clear to see then that the death of a couple of people with alcohol problems could easily be overlooked. The charming, saintly character that Palmer outwardly projected took a bit more of a battering with the death of his wife and his brother. Both died after medical attention from Palmer, and both died soon after Palmer had taken out extortionate life insurance policies on them. You see, what I probably should have mentioned before was that Palmer loved to spend money. He loved spending money, even when it wasn't his, and by 1854 he was heavily in debt. He insured his wife Annie's life for £13,000, a considerable sum back in those days, and shortly afterwards she died. The death was recorded by one of Palmer's doctor friends as being caused by cholera, and not much more was made of it. It's worth noting that Palmer's housemaid Eliza had an illegitimate child with Palmer, and it was born just 9 months after his wife's death. The baby died not much longer after that. The insurance companies only began to be suspicious when Palmer insured his brother Walter's life. Walter was also an alcoholic, and Palmer tried many different insurance companies, hoping to insure his life for a total of £80,000. The actual sum he got was much smaller, but when Walter died soon after the policy had been taken out, tongues obviously started wagging. Many other people died after having contact with Palmer, including racing buddies and his uncle, whom Palmer openly disliked. But it wasn't until the death of his close friend, John Parsons Cook, on November 14, 1855, in the Talbot Arms Hotel in Rugeley, that people really began to suspect Palmer. Before then, even though he hadn't been charged for any of the deaths, there were rumours and jokes made in the local public houses, jokes which apparently Palmer even encouraged. It is said that when meeting up with a friend, he'd slap them on the back and ask, "And what's your poison, lad? Prussic acid or arsenic?" Many believe this is where the phrase "what's your poison" comes from. Don't know if that's true. John Parsons Cook became violently ill after drinking with Palmer, and it's said he even accused the doctor of poisoning him, having heard all of the local rumours. Days later, after hours of agony, he died, the cause of death being written as apoplexy. Cook's stepfather became suspicious of Palmer when he arrived in Rugeley to see the body, and this eventually led to the arrest of the doctor for suspected murder. The evidence was completely circumstantial and rested heavily on Palmer having purchased strychnine prior to Cook's death, whose demise vaguely resembled the effects of strychnine poisoning. It also hadn't helped that Palmer had attempted to bribe anyone involved with the post-mortem or the investigation into giving him information, and it's even said he tried to sabotage the contents of Cook's stomach during the examination of his body, which he had attended not as a suspect but as a medical man. The 12-day trial was held in the Old Bailey in London, as the Lord Chancellor thought the strong feelings against Palmer in Stafford would have a negative effect on the trial. And after many somewhat conflicting statements were taken from prominent doctors of the age, a verdict of willful murder was brought against him. He was sentenced to go back to Stafford, where he would be hanged in public. He maintained his innocence to the very end, refusing to confess for the good of his soul, even when urged to by his family.
Sorry for the interruption, but I just have to tell you about Jessica Grace Coleman's new book, Intentional Travel Transformation. Boost your confidence, conquer your fears, and finally become the person you've always wanted to be, which is out now. This book is part memoir, part practical guide to help you transform yourself and your life through travel. Learn about Jessica's own tale of travel transformation, read unique transformation stories from the travel buddies she's met on the road, and make your way through her travel transformation framework, a method you can follow to create your very own bespoke travel transformation strategy. Your roadmap you can use to incorporate intentional travel into all your future trips. So, have you packed your bags yet? because it's time to flip the script on your life and transform through travel. Get intentional travel transformation now from Amazon, or head to www.traveltransformationcoach.com/books for more info. And now let's get back to the Travel Transformation Podcast.
It is said that the hangman George Smith spent the night before the execution talking to locals in one of the nearby public houses, highly enjoying his newfound celebrity as the man who would hang the Rugeley poisoner. At 8 a.m. on Saturday, 14th of June 1856, Palmer was led to the scaffold outside the jail. Crowds had been gathering since 3 a.m. and it was estimated that there were approximately 3 times the amount of people who usually turned up to watch the big executions. Some people secured viewing points on balconies and platforms, some brought telescopes, and locals even hired out their gardens to eager spectators. The condemned man was bareheaded and dressed in prison dress, as his normal clothes had been left in London, and he calmly walked to the platform in front of 30,000 onlookers. There is an old rumour that, as Palmer was looking at the hanging rope, he asked Smith, in what would have been his last words, if it was safe. I can't guarantee that these words are actually spoken, as most other accounts have Palmer's last words as being "God bless you," spoken to Smith. In any case, he shook his executioner's hand, had the rope placed around his neck, a hood over his face, and then he fell to his death. Even at the last hour, he didn't admit to the crime. After his body had been hanging for the usual amount of time, it was cut down and taken inside the prison, where a death mask was taken of his head. This death mask is now stored in the archives of the museum at nearby Shugborough Hall. According to the sentence, Palmer's remains were then buried within the grounds of the prison, his body unable to join the other members of his family in their final resting place. The rope that was made to hang Palmer was deliberately made too long so it could be cut into pieces and sold to bloodthirsty locals. Broadsheets and ballads were also sold in the area as souvenirs of his execution, and he was given the name the Prince of Poisoners by the public. A model of Palmer stood in Madame Tussauds Chamber of Horrors in London for 127 years. A small endnote to this terrible tale is that some prominent Rugeley men of the day were concerned that their town would be forever associated with the Prince of Poisoners, and petitioned to the then Prime Minister to get a name change. The PM, who wasn't exactly known for his sense of humour, agreed, as long as it was named after him. After considering this compromise, the Rugeley men decided they could live with the town's name after all, for the Prime Minister of the day was Henry John Temple, also known as Lord Palmerston. George Smith's career as a hangman didn't go so well after the death of Palmer. In 1866, during the execution of murderer William Collier, who had been found guilty of killing a prominent man from near Cheadle, he made a mistake and didn't secure the rope to the beam hook properly. Therefore, when it came time for Collier to drop to his death, he went straight down into the pit with the hanging rope falling beside him. Smith got it right the next time, and Collier finally dropped to his death, having had to go through the whole ordeal twice. Smith left the scene much more of a villain than the man everyone had come to see swing, and the botched hanging was the last public execution that took place in Stafford. We'll leave the tales of long-gone murderers and hangmen there, but it is worth noting that many Stafford residents have reported hearing ghostly sounds of screams outside the jail, and some have even seen visions of people wringing their hands in terror at the horrible sight of the raised platform, the beam, and the long twisted rope. Before we go, I would also like to point out the interesting layout of this road. Back in Palmer's times, if you'd had far too much to drink in one of the public houses, which is the Greyhound pub, you'd usually end up either in there, there's a funeral home right next door, or there, the main doors of the prison. At least here on County Road you wouldn't have to go far to get to either. Now, the ancient High House. Originally built in 1595, it has been said that the ancient High House is England's largest surviving timber-frame townhouse from the 16th century. It's been through quite a lot of changes during the years, being a place of residence, a Civil War prison, a school, shops, and a museum. And if you grew up in Stafford, you'll know that it is a rite of passage to go to the museum as a school trip. And you usually get separated into the posh people and the servants. I'm not sure if that's a good thing for school children, but there we go. In 1642, King Charles I stayed here on his way to Shrewsbury. He obviously didn't make a very good impression, though. Stafford's MP, John Bradshaw, went on to be the chief judge in the trial of Charles I and a signatory of his death warrant. Bradshaw died himself in 1659, but his body wouldn't rest for long. After the restoration of Charles II in 1660, his remains were dug up and symbolically hanged, like others who were so-called regicides. Due to its long history, the building has its fair share of paranormal tales associated with it. Reports of a heavy oak door opening and closing on its own, as well as a large black figure appearing in the doorway, have scared more than a few members of staff in recent years. The second floor has a spooky Victorian room where there have been sightings of an old woman in a rocking chair accompanied by a young girl who stares blankly ahead at nothing in particular. Now that sounds creepy. As is often the case with haunted places, the temperature in the Victorian room is often uncomfortably cold. Another girl by the name of Naughty Mary also resides in the building, so named because she likes to pull people's hair, especially if you share the same vivid red hair colour as her. There have also been reports of another female spirit who is naughty for different reasons. She has been seen undressing in an upper-storey room and has also been seen leading a spirit man into a room where there is a prominent four-poster bed. There you go. Probably the most bizarre ghostly occurrence was experienced by a group of American visitors in the 1960s. During this time, the house had fallen into disrepair. Yet when the Americans came across the high house, they were greeted by a handsome and knowledgeable guide who showed them proudly around the building. It is said that the next day they returned with some friends who also wanted to go on the tour, but they found the high house to be inaccessible. The contractor of the building refused them entry as it was currently too dangerous to enter. On further investigation, the Americans found that the guide matched the description of William Marson. Marson owned a shop in the building selling exotic foods and rare products from the East. The only problem with this explanation was that he had died about 50 years previously. Derek Okora and his team of paranormal investigators also visited the high house when they were in Stafford. After a member of staff had gone to them speaking of an apparition in the doorway, wearing a large hat and cloak. During the filming, Derek came across an angry spirit who he immediately took a dislike to, but started channeling him anyway. He told the others he was a prisoner and that he wasn't well. He called himself Starkey and proceeded to mumble the words, "didn't hurt anyone," and "bullet to his head." The prisoner was definitely not a ladies' man, as he repeatedly told Daniela Westbrook, one of Derek's sidekicks, that she was a foolish lady, causing her to cry. Interestingly, Derek also channeled another ghost, a man who owned a shop in the building. He said it was 1892 and that his name was William Mason. We'll forgive Derek for getting Marson's name wrong. He did only leave out a letter R, after all. A female staff member asked Derek, as William, if he played an instrument, to which the spirit got aggressive and said, "You know I did, you silly woman." It would seem that neither of the high house ghosts were particularly enamoured with the fairer sex. When told that he had passed over, the spirit of William got angry as he was convinced it was 1892 and that he was still alive. And probably angry that Derek Okora was trying to assess him. As local historian Jeff Elkin agreed, Marson would have been at his most influential at around the start of the 1890s. I'll leave it to you to decide what you think of the Asian high house's colourful characters. I think I'd better say at this point that I'm very open to the idea of ghosts. I think everything's made of energy, and maybe, energy never dies, it gets transferred to other things. Do I believe things like Derek Okora's ghost town? Not so much. I do enjoy watching them though, they are entertaining. But yeah, the fact that he got his name wrong, someone obviously told him it was William Marson and he thought it was Mason. I don't know. See what you think. The Swan. So here we are at the infamous Dodo, as Mr. Dickens called the Swan. Luckily, it's had a bit of a makeover since the time of Dickens' stay and is now a thriving hotel with a popular bar and restaurant. This new-look Swan Hotel doesn't shy away from its checkered past, however, as it proudly displays some of Dickens' words on its website, proving that nowadays there is no such thing as bad publicity. The Swan is a former coaching inn and is thought to have been two houses that were combined in the mid-18th century. The original inn was a refuge to travellers and came complete with stables out the back for the horses. Of course, Dickens didn't like those either, as he described them as silent, grass-grown, broken-windowed, horseless. Not what we want for a stable. It is around this point in his plated article that Dickens seems to get rather restless. He is left by the fire in the Dodo with a pint decanter and a little thin, funnel-shaped wineglass and a plate of pale biscuits, in themselves engendering desperation. In his despair of boredom, he asks, "What am I to do? I can't go to bed because I have conceived a mortal hatred for my bedroom, and I can't go away because there is no train for my place of destination until morning." He thinks of burning the biscuits in the fire, and although he knows this will be a fleeting joy and temporary relief, he throws them onto the fire just for something to do. He then thinks of breaking the plate, but seeing where it was made, decides against it. At this point in the article, the plate actually starts talking to him about the factory in Stoke-on-Trent where it was born. Now, although this is just a literary technique to tell the reader about his enjoyable visit to the potteries, you know it's bad when not only do you start talking to inanimate objects, but they start talking back. Now, there are many rumours regarding the Swan. It is said there were underground tunnels linking the hotel to St Mary's Church and also Stafford Castle over a mile away, and that the site of the hotel may at one time have been a drowning pool in which women were drowned if they'd been charged with witchcraft. We'll be hearing more about witches soon. Of course, any building this old has its fair share of ghostly stories. Believed to have been built on the site of a monastic college, spirits seem to be rife here. There is the story of the mysterious White Lady, who some say is the ghost of a woman who was jilted. The story goes that she felt so low she hanged herself in one of the rooms, which doesn't seem so hard to believe after Dickens' description of his time at the Dodo. She reportedly spooked a past hotel manager by standing at the end of his bed, and succeeded in scaring off one of the chefs. On the Swan's website, they have a page entitled Guests That Won't Leave, alluding to their previous customers who liked staying at the hotel so much that even after their death, it is the place they keep returning to. I think we can safely say that the spirit of Charles Dickens won't have been back here. St Chad's Church and the Witch Bottle. Now, here we are at St Chad's. The exact date it was built is unknown, but it is believed to be the oldest church in Stafford, being built before St Mary's, which we'll see in a while. I've actually brought you around here not to talk of the church itself, but to talk of a mysterious object that was found not a few steps from here, where the council buildings now stand. There used to be a pub on that site called the Turk's Head Inn, and when the land was being dug up to make way for the new buildings, a team of archaeologists came to see what discoveries could be made. So, what was this strange finding? To use its most simple name, it was a witch bottle. This was from the 17th century, and it was basically a device used to scare off witches and evil spirits. The actual name of the vessel was a Bellarmine jar from Germany, and was named after the Cardinal Bellarmine. Bellarmine? I don't know. A Roman Catholic leader of the Counter-Reformation, who at the time would have been a formidable figure to Protestant England. The jar is around 6 inches high and features a grotesque version of Bellarmine's face on its front, a hostile caricature of the cardinal. Now, a witch bottle wasn't the only way to ward off witches. People also used runes, which they'd carry around with them, and they would sprinkle salt around the entrances to their house. However, the use of the witch bottle is probably one of the most disgusting, at least to our modern day selves. The idea was you filled the bottle with a mixture of hair, urine, and nail clippings before burying it under your floorboards or behind your door in order to scare away the spirits or witches. The bottle was investigated by the Oxford archaeology team, but unfortunately none of the contents had survived due to the jug's seal being missing and its upside-down position in the soil, as was the custom when burying witch bottles. However, we can see from other findings what the contents of the Stafford witch bottle were likely to have been. In 2004, a similar relic was found in Greenwich, London, the first complete witch bottle found in Britain, and this one was still sealed. The contents included nail clippings, hair, brass pins, iron nails, the urine, of course, a heart-shaped piece of leather pierced by a nail, and belly button fluff. Ugh. How do they know it was belly button fluff? Anyway, as witches were often blamed for ill health, the idea of the witch bottles was to deflect the supposed spell back onto the witch. The urine in the bottle represented the witch's waterworks, and much like the idea of voodoo dolls, the nails and pins in the bottle were meant to aggravate the witch's system whenever she tried to pass water. Well, that's not nice. The witch would then be left in so much pain that she would be forced to drop whatever spell she'd put on the inflicted person. As another insight to the thoughts of people at the time, G.T. Lawley, in his Staffordshire Customs book, listed the rules for people who wished to discover a witch. 1. Oh dear. If a person was very sleepy in the daytime, it was a sure sign he or she had been revelling with the devil in the night. Oh dear. Yep, that's me. 2. To talk with oneself was a sign that the person was talking to his familiar imp. I mean, I'm talking to myself right now, recording this podcast. 3. To be seen lurking near the house of a sick person was a suspicious sign. 4. To show sympathy with a witch, a sure sign of complicity. 5. To be frightened when accused, a sure sign of guilt, of course. And 6. To be cool under the same circumstances, a sign that the devil was aiding his follower. So, yeah, much like the Salem witch trials, you could not win. I can't help but think that if we followed these contradictory rules today, almost everyone would be accused of being a witch, especially with the rule about being sleepy in the daytime. Stafford is home to quite a few students, after all. Haha. I thought it was very funny when I was writing this script, obviously. Now, the soup kitchen. I love the soup kitchen. It's great, great food. The soup kitchen dates from the 16th century and has its own resident ghost known as Ethel. Apparitions have been seen in the entrance hall, hot plates have been turned on and off, and objects have even been known to fly off the shelves. The oven has mysteriously been switched on and off before reaching its optimum temperature, as well as the hot plate for the coffee, leaving the food, drink, and guests cold. Interestingly, the switch to the oven is in a cupboard, not easily reached, and the hot plate is under the counter, making it impossible for members of staff to have knocked it off or turned it off without knowing. 2 cleaners of the soup kitchen have also come across Ethel. They both avoided attending a certain room in the cafe as they could hear the other cleaning in it. When they met up with each other again, it became apparent that neither had been making the noises in the room. They were the only 2 in the building. Other staff members were disturbed by a racket coming from the baking area, which they found out was the sound of plates spinning on the floor. Again, they were the only 2 in the building. Perhaps the most fascinating occurrence was experienced by 2 members of staff who ventured into the staff room one evening to be confronted with paper cups being thrown at them from a side room. When they went outside to take out the rubbish, they were again bombarded, this time with the lids from the paper cups. And guess what? They were the only 2 in the building. The next morning, the manager arrived to find paper cups and lids strewn everywhere, as well as a notice which one of his members of staff had hastily handed in. Now, St. Mary's Church. Here we come to St. Mary's Church at the centre of Stafford, the stone structure believed to have been built around 1000 AD. In 1250, the Dean and Chapter of St. Mary's were given the right to hold their own courts to punish criminals within the deanery manor. They were allowed to have their own gallows for hanging male offenders, and for the female offenders, a water pit for drowning. Both of these would have been established in the courtyard. While we're talking about forms of punishment, I'll quickly describe the ducking stool, or cooking stool, C-U-C-K-I-N-G, that was popular from around the 17th to 19th centuries. This device was basically a long pole with a chair at the end, the chair being reserved for unquiet or scolding women, who might be being punished for, say, having an illegitimate child or for prostitution. It just keeps coming back to those queens, I'm afraid. The cooking stool would be fixed at the edge of a pond, so the offender would be repeatedly lowered and immersed in filthy water, no doubt while the locals watched on, munching on their popcorn. The main point of this was for social humiliation and public exposure. We know that Stafford had a cook stool, as they called it in this county, and used it regularly at the start of the 17th century, as there are records of its upkeep. It had to be repaired in 1620 and again in 1623, possibly from overuse. Here we see St. Bertalin's cross. And again, no idea if I'm saying that right. St. Bertalin is the patron saint of Stafford, as he founded the town in around 700 AD when the area was part of the Kingdom of Mercia. Sounds a bit posher than the Midlands, doesn't it? He chose the area as the site of his hermitage as it was uninhabited, and continued his holy vocation on the islet of Bethany, as Stafford was then known. Also a way better name. These foundation stones show where St. Bertalin's chapel was originally built. Imagine you can see foundation stones. And the cross in the middle is a replica of the cross lying beneath the ground about 5 feet down. This preaching cross of St. Bertalin's is supposedly where he held his outdoor gatherings. Now, if you take nothing else from this tour, please remember St. Bertalin's name, as without him, Stafford may not be the same today. And to be honest, I don't think he gets the credit he deserves. If anyone's seen the Stafford Borough coat of arms, the guy with the staff is St. Bertalin. And if anyone likes cheese, there's a company in Eccleshall called Bertalin Farmhouse Cheese. I'm not sure that St. Bertalin ever had anything to do with the production of cheese, but they've named a whole range of cheeses after that saint anyway, and at least his name is being kept alive, even if only in the form of delicious dairy products. If anyone's interested, St. Bertalin's shrine can be found in the Church of the Holy Cross in Ileham in Derbyshire, where he died. And I have notes here: on the way to the alehouse, point out the human head in St. Mary's Church, not a literal one, a stone one if you go down the side of McDonald's and look at eye height at the church. And also a dragon with folded wings above Thompson Local. It's probably not called Thompson Local anymore. And then we have the Stafford Alehouse / Noah's Ark. We end our tour here at the Stafford Alehouse, or the Surgery as it was known a few years ago. That name may give you a hint as to why we've come here, as this building has a link with a certain Dr. William Palmer, who, as I'm sure you'll remember, ended his short life outside Stafford Jail in front of 30,000 spectators. Originally built as a townhouse in the 16th century, by the 19th century it was the Noah's Ark public house, and it was famous for Queen Elizabeth's visit in 1575, first one, when she took wine here during her journey through the town. In 1883, there were so many public houses in Stafford that a drinks map was drawn up, showing you exactly where they are all located. When the pub was known as the Surgery, there were many reports of ghostly phenomena surrounding the building. These included cold spots, noises coming from the empty bar, furniture being moved around, and non-existent calls being registered on people's mobiles. Crying has been heard in the empty ladies' toilets on more than one occasion, and some patrons have reported being pushed by an invisible force. I spent a lot of my youth hanging out at the Surgery and getting drunk, and I can't say I ever felt an invisible force or heard crying in the empty ladies' toilets, unless I just assumed it was a drunk person. Anyway, the Surgery was also host to Derek Okora again and his team when they came with their Ghost Towns show, and they conducted a séance in the building. Derek immediately sensed two spirits, one of a kind woman and one of a mischievous man, who kept trying to trip up members of the staff. I mean, if you're a ghost, you've got to make it your own fun, haven't you? Derek said this man was under the thumb and took it to be the spirit of Colonel William Brooks, whose mistress was Palmer's mother-in-law, Mary Thornton. He then surmised that the female spirit must be that of Mrs. Thornton herself, who, as we've heard, died less than 2 weeks after she moved in with Palmer. Colonel Brooks and later Mary Thornton owned the Noah's Ark, as well as several other buildings in Stafford, and this pub is one of the properties that Palmer hoped would fall into his wife's possession at the passing of her mother. We know that it didn't. We also know that Colonel Brooks killed himself after a miserable life with his horrible alcoholic mistress. So for Derek Okora to call him a mischievous joker and her a kind woman seems a little out of character for both. During the séance in the Surgery, staff members felt someone playing with their hair, touching their heads and gripping their arms. In one spectacular scene, Derek Okora gets pushed off his chair by the spirit, landing on the floor in a daze. Still convinced this was the spirit of Colonel Brooks messing them around, Derek ended the séance there. Now, do these sound like the movements of a miserable, suicidal, under-the-thumb colonel? Or was it perhaps the behaviour of the vicious, alcoholic mother-in-law, Mrs. Thornton? Perhaps they were even the actions of the evil doctor himself, coming back to haunt the town where he met his horrific end. I'll leave it to you to decide. This concludes our tour tonight. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the less savoury side of our little town. It then says we'd like to welcome you all to stay and have a drink in the Stafford Ale House, if you don't mind sharing the place with a couple of other kind of spirits. Haha. Yeah, we even got discounts, 10% off discounts for food and drink in the Ale House, as it was called then. They sold lots of pies. But as I said, it never happened. These days, I think it's still going on. Upstairs at the pub, it's called Red Rum, and they have rock gigs there. And yeah, so maybe his spirit is still roaming around having a good old mosh. I don't know. So yeah, that is the Darker Times of Stafford tour that I wrote, I don't even know how many years ago this was, many, many years ago, and it never came to fruition. And I've always thought it's a shame that I did all this work, all this research. I got so many books out of the library. I had like little sticker tab things on all the way through it. I did so much research. I find it so fascinating. You might think it's grisly or macabre, but I'm fascinated by this kind of stuff. And like I say, ghosts stuff fascinates me. Though I was never convinced by Derek Okora. I'm sorry. But yeah, I hope this has entertained you, hopefully. I know some of it was grisly and people might not like that, but I think it's important that we know the good things about our hometowns or the places we live and the bad things. And knowing this kind of history gives you a richer sense of what happened there in the past. And it's good for like pub trivia and, stories at dinner parties. I don't know, although you probably don't want to hear about people hanging while eating your dinner. Anyway, I think I'm going to keep this as one episode, so I'm going to sign off now before it gets too long. But I hope this makes you look into your own history of your hometown, like I said. And let me know if you find anything interesting or spooky, because I'm all about spooky stuff. You can email me at info@traveltransformationcoach.com, or you can DM me on Instagram at traveltransformationcoach. And just remember, it's perfectly fine to be a tourist in your own city, your own town, your own village, and have fun with it. And until next time, I'll catch you on the flip side. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Travel Transformation Podcast with me, Jessica Grace Coleman. If you enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate it if you could please subscribe, rate and review, and spread the word, because it's my mission to help as many people as possible to flip the script on their lives and transform through travel. And remember, life is short, so let's make sure it's nothing short of amazing. Until next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.